Andrea, munching on dried fish, asked Roland why he had summoned them. Roland playfully suggested they guess, promising an extra serving of ice cream sandwich for dinner if they got it right. Andrea's interest was immediately piqued. Ashes hypothesized that it might be to install plumbing in the room. Nightingale scoffed, pointing out that for simple plumbing, such large pipes wouldn't be necessary. Andrea felt a rush of camaraderie. Nightingale had thought just like herself, only Nightingale from the Witches' Union had the audacity to address the extraordinary witch in that tone. Since arriving at the border town, the only witch she felt closest to was Nightingale. They shared noble backgrounds and identical hair colors, recognized each other's combat abilities, and Nightingale was even willing to share her dried fish. Most importantly, she also had some beef with Ashes. Ashes huffed in response. Nightingale, smirking, mentioned that she was by Roland's side when he was drafting the designs, so she knew what they were for. Rem protested that it was unfair. Roland chuckled and declared that Nightingale was disqualified from this guessing game. As a hint to the witches, Roland mentioned the pipes were just a part of a system and suggested they might get their answer by exploring other places. Maisie and Lightning immediately zoomed out of the room. Andrea whispered to Nightingale, asking what it was all about. Nightingale confessed that even though she had seen the designs, she didn't understand them. She mused that if anyone in the Witches' Union could comprehend Roland's intentions just from the blueprints, it would probably only be Anna. After much hesitation, Andrea ultimately decided against asking Anna. Following the prince's hint, Andrea went from room to room, inspecting everything she could find. In the rooms that were completed, she noticed that the copper pipes were shielded with right-angled iron grates as if to prevent anyone from touching them. Outside, one of the pipes connected directly to the well in the courtyard. She speculated that it might be used to heat water, but that seemed too cumbersome. Prince Roland gathered all the witches in the grand hall and announced the official launch of the castle's heating system. Roland explained that firepan were inconvenient to move and required windows to be opened for ventilation, otherwise, there was a risk of carbon monoxide poisoning. The new heating system had no such concerns. Apart from Anna, Soraya, and Hummingbird who were involved in the installation, the only one who guessed correctly was Tilly. All of them would receive the promised ice cream sandwich. Today, Roland was set to give a public lecture on the preparation of nitrogen, with Kyle assisting in the explanation. Roland initially believed Agatha and Kyle might dislike each other. Since on one hand, there was the chief alchemist of Border Town, passionate about alchemy to a fault and seemingly indifferent to others' feelings and perspectives. On the other hand, was a witch from a kingdom that existed for centuries ago, wearing the pride of being a member of the top research institution, the Exploration Society. Both were incredibly straightforward, and pairing them up seemed like putting two volatile components together, an explosion waiting to happen. Surprisingly, they got along exceptionally well. Kyle felt Agatha had done him a significant favor, while Agatha thought highly of Kyle's vast knowledge. After extracting the nitrogen, the majority exclaimed that they couldn't see it. Roland then posed a question: how could one prove that nitrogen was different from air? Tilly, Agatha, and Anna all provided the correct answers. Roland was thrilled with the deep academic atmosphere. However, the rest of the witches were utterly lost. Barav and Axe, who were also present, were just as perplexed. Nevertheless, Axe firmly believed that if it came from His Highness, then it must be correct. Atop the city walls, the riflemen were poised and ready. Facing the looming tide of darkness on the horizon, they calmly conducted their final weapon checks before resting their rifle barrels on the crenels. One soldier caught sight of the witches. Another remarked on how beautiful they all looked, recalling how the church had painted them as ugly and terrifying before he came to the border town. Yet another said, not only were they beautiful, but they were also incredibly powerful. He spoke of Ashes wielding the massive sword, able to bring down a mixed-breed demonic beast with a single strike. How he wished he had such strength. Suddenly, a third soldier shushed him, whispering fears about it being the power of demons. The pony-tailed soldier gave him a good smack on the head, scolding him for such nonsense. He reminded him that Lady Manhua was also a witch, asking if he considered her a demon as well. Lowering his voice, he warned that uttering such things in front of the veterans of the First Army would lead to a beating. With that chit-chat settled, their gaze shifted back to the oncoming horde. This wave of demonic beasts wasn't much different from previous encounters, but then they spotted something massive within, an enormous demonic beast, unlike any they'd seen before. It was much taller than the city wall itself, its massive horns and teeth were size of a full-grown man. They knew rifles would be useless against such a creature, they'd need the artillery crew. Glancing towards the position of the new cannon, its silvery barrel was already in motion. The gun slowly pivoted, aiming directly at the charging behemoth. A brilliant flash lit the scene, followed by a deafening roar. Unfortunately, it was missed. Andrea and Ashes hurried over upon hearing the commotion. As they arrived, a second earth-shaking roar resonated, this time, striking the colossal demonic beast squarely in the chest. The monster stiffly fell sideways with a heavy thud, its immense weight echoing across the battlefield, squishing many demonic beasts along the way. Unable to contain their exhilaration, the soldiers let out a triumphant cheer. Even such a fearsome and ferocious enemy couldn't stand against the mighty weapon invented by His Highness. And everyone on the city walls began to chant Roland's name. Roland only received the news after the battle had concluded. Upon rushing to the city wall, the massive body of the demonic beast still lay silently in the snow. Agatha, who had followed him, widened her eyes in recognition. She identified the creature as a hell dreadbeast. Agatha explained that several towns had been flattened by the hell dreadbeast's rampages. However, they were only ever seen as the ominous blood moon drew near. Roland, then recalling the diary entries mentioning that when the sky displayed a blood-red moon, the gates of hell would open again, he asked for an explanation. Agatha replied, implying that their time was running short, with at most 5 years remaining. At first, Roland was shocked but felt a bit relieved after fully understanding her words. Agatha looked at Roland, noticing his lack of urgency. Roland commented that 5 years are plenty. Based on their current pace of development, he'd be able to equip the entire army with new firearms in just 1 more year. 5 years would grant him ample time to ensure that the land, population, and resources reached a higher standard. He hoped to establish 3 more industrial cities that would provide a constant supply of food and ammunition, along with providing basic education for the people. By the end of 5 years, he could line the entire city walls with these cannons. It seemed as though Agatha had made up her mind. She took a deep breath and promised Roland that she would do her utmost to produce liquid nitrogen and liquid oxygen for him. Looking at Roland straight in the eyes, before she could finish her sentence, Roland reassured her that they would definitely defeat the demons. By evening, Evelyn returned to her apartment. The warmth of the hallway enveloped her immediately. The difference between the inside and the outside of the apartment felt like 2 different worlds. Walking through the living room, she noticed Andrea, Ashes, and Savvy engaged in a game of poker. Each of them had several pieces of paper stuck on their face. Andrea explained that the one with the most paper would owe the winner an ice cream sandwich the next time. Andrea invited Evelyn to join in. Evelyn pointed out that final exams were approaching, suggesting that everyone should be studying. Andrea responded by saying that the material was easy for her, and both Ashes and Savvy nodded in agreement. It was then that Evelyn remembered Andrea came from nobility, and both Ashes and Savvy can read and write. Politely declining the invitation, Evelyn chose to head back to her room and study. The next day, the witches sat together in the classroom, awaiting scroll to distribute the exam papers. Andrea was mentally counting, besides the ice cream sandwich everyone would receive after the exam, she'd have the additional one she won from Ashes and Savvy yesterday. That meant she could indulge in 3 portions alone. As for the exam, Andrea was fairly confident. The test papers were quickly handed out. She raced through the questions on the first page, but as she flipped the page, she realized she couldn't understand the math problems that followed. Taking a deep breath, she suddenly turned her head to sneak a peek at Nightingale in the row behind her, but Nightingale's expression showcased that she had no idea what was going on. Nightingale was staring blankly at the paper, a quill held to her mouth, her gaze unchanging for a long while. Looking over to Evelyn, she and Maisie were slowly working out the problems with their fingers. And when she glanced at Ashes, she had the same stunned look as Nightingale. During the tension, Scroll announced the end of the exam. Andrea leaned back in her chair, watching as her paper was collected, suddenly feeling that the 3 portions of ice cream sandwich that evening might not be as sweet as she'd imagined. Scroll brought all the papers back to Roland's office. Roland saw a myriad of bizarre answers, or in some cases, he could sense the test-taker's agony and anguish between the lines. Nightingale asked why Anna didn't have to participate. Roland smiled while saying that Anna and Scroll were the ones who had prepared the exam. She then inquired about Tilly, to which Roland explained that Tilly had played the role of the examiner, having done the test in advance to check for any oversights, and had scored full marks. Once all the scores were tallied, he found that the first group of witches from Slumbering Isle had all shown noticeable improvement. Everyone had passed this time. Evelyn's improvement was the most significant. The scores of the 3 newly arrived combat witches were somewhat low. Nightingale's performance was rather disappointing. Her scores in 3 subjects were even lower than her previous test, making Roland somewhat bemused. It seemed that learning truly was a natural talent, sometimes it just couldn't be forced. The only one that puzzled him was Maisie. She hardly got any computational questions right in mathematics and sciences, and the formulas she used were utterly gibberish. However, she scored 90% on the multiple choice and true or false questions, resulting in an overall score of 63, which was somewhat unexpected. Roland really couldn't fathom how Maisie managed to do it. In the kitchen, Maisie and Lightning were preparing food. Maisie joyfully remarked how lucky she was to have gotten a double-yolked egg again. Lightning commented how Maisie always have such good luck. Maine had become the new pope. He once again descended into the dungeon. The last time he came here, it was to secretly execute the King of Grey Castle, Wimbledon III. He ignored the lamentations and cries of the others, heading straight to a specific cell door. The guard opened it for him, and he stepped inside. He saw Zero. The Pure Witch stood with her back towards the entrance, hands shackled to an iron bar above her head. Dozens of fresh whip marks marred her back. Maine asked Zero if she realized her mistake. Zero groaned softly as if roused from sleep. Seeing that it was Maine who had come, she laughed and asked, "When Maine seek obedience, does he mean obedience to Maine specifically, or a respectful attitude towards all the other bishops as well?" Although displeased by Zero's tone, Maine answered straightforwardly, "Obviously it's obedience to his commands." Zero responded that if Maine demanded as such, she would obey. Maine then ordered the guards to unshackle her. With his staff, he picked up her clothes, tossed them to her, and instructed her to get dressed and follow him. He had a mission for her. Zero casually draped the clothes over herself and followed him out of the long prison corridor. Maine began explaining that this year's month of the demons might last up to 5 months. He commanded Zero and the other pure witches to head to the Grey Castle. They were to exploit the chaos brought by the heavy snowfall to exterminate the rebels. On their list was Timothy Wimbledon and Roland Wimbledon. After waiting a long while without getting a response from Zero, he was about to punish her once again. Maine, with a stern face, turned only to find Zero's lips curled in a smirk, her eyes radiating a dangerous glint. A shimmering light appeared. When Maine opened his eyes again, he found himself standing in a vast plaza. He suddenly realized that this was the old holy city from when he had just become a believer. Zero suddenly materialized, mentioning that this was the place that left the deepest impression on Maine and that she admired it. Memories that momentarily faded reconnected in an instant. He felt a surge of anger and whipped around, his eyes locked intensely on Zero. He couldn't believe Zero dared use her powers on him. Zero spoke nonchalantly, "She is well aware of what she is doing. But for Maine, perhaps he don't fully understand." Maine was familiar with this power, knowing well that this was a spiritual battlefield, or one battles solely with consciousness within the world constructed by the intruder. Here, the victor gains all, and the loser is stripped of everything. He reached for the god's punishment stone necklace hidden under his clothing, wondering why it was ineffective. Seeing through Main's thoughts, Zero chuckled, its domain has been nullified. A realization hit Main. Only one person possessed such an ability, Isabella. He felt the sting of betrayal. If he had known earlier, he would have converted them all into God's punishment army. But regrets were futile now. All he could do was take a deep breath and probe for answers. Main quickly regained his composure. He threatened Zero, if Zero kill him, the Judgment Army outside will notice and apprehend her. And what awaits her won't just be flogging. Zero shook her head, she have no plans to flee. Instead, she aimed to replace Main and ascend to the position of the Pope. Main was taken aback by Zero's declaration, exclaiming, a pure one could never become the Pope. And the one to be crowned in front of the multitude of believers in the Grand Cathedral is Main. No one would recognize Zero as the Pope. Yet, Zero responded, she don't need to show her face. Acting as the Pope's messenger will suffice. After all, Oberlin remained secluded in the holy secret temple for years, and on the rare occasions he ventured out, he would wear a mask. No one will notice a change in the Pope. As Main continued with threats, Zero coolly interjected, once the spiritual battle begins, it cannot be interrupted. Furthermore, no one will apprehend her. Main were mistaken from the very start. Main gazed into Zero's eyes, finding no trace of emotion, only a serene, unwavering gaze staring back at him. Main's mind suddenly raced back to Oberlin's last words, let go of the Pope position could also be a good choice. My child, I'm sorry. He felt as if he had plunged into a chasm of ice. With chilling clarity, Main finally understood everything. Zero then elaborated, this battlefield was orchestrated by Pope Oberlin for them. Once the spiritual battle concludes, the survivor will become the true ruler of the church.